In this section of the course, we're going to talk about how to edit food photos using your iPhone. Editing is an integral part of the digital photography process, regardless of how good a photo is straight out of camera. Editing is that extra step that can take an already good photo to a great or amazing photo. As you'll see in this section with food photography, editing is best used sparingly. So there's no reason to be intimidated by editing in this case, because I'm going to go over just the basic editing processes that you'll need to know in order to add just that extra little bit to make your photo stand out. This course is going to discuss the general editing process using Photos on your iPhone. Photos is a built-in app native to all iPhone models. This app is used to store, organize, edit, and share photos. On this slide, we can see a list of third-party editing apps. Lightroom Photo Editor or Lightroom Mobile is a free and paid subscription. The free version has most of the tools available and much more advanced control than what Photos gives you. Lightroom allows you to store, organize, edit, and share photos, but it has the added step of importing photos into its library. Snapseed is another great all-rounder photo editing app, and it has tons of advanced tools like selective adjusting and clone stamping. Visco, Darkroom, and Afterlight are all similar third-party editing apps that are commonly used for their filters and presets. After taking this course and getting familiar with editing using photos, I would highly recommend looking into learning how to edit using Lightroom. Lightroom is a much more advanced editing tool than Photos. The tools in Lightroom can quickly level up your photos by allowing you to really fine-tune the tones and exposure of your image, and the color correction tools in Lightroom are far superior to Photos. Lightroom Mobile is discussed in great length in our iPhone photo editing course, which can be found at photographytips.com, and I highly recommend you checking out this course if Lightroom is something that you're interested in learning. The editing workspace within Photos can be accessed by tapping any image in your gallery and then tapping the Edit tool in the top toolbar, which is going to open the editing workspace. At the very bottom of this workspace, you'll see a toolbar that allows you to switch between the different panels of the workspace. By default, the Edit workspace is going to open in the Adjust panel. To the right of the Adjust panel is our Filter section. On the far right is the Crop section. And on the far left, if your image was taken using the Live Photo feature, you'll have a fourth panel which opens up to reveal the Live panel, which allows you to select a new frame from that live photo and make that your key photo. In each of these panels, your editing tools are located underneath your image, and you can scroll to reveal more tools. Under each tool, a slider will appear that allows you to adjust the intensity of that given parameter. So in this section, we're going to go through each of the editing processes step by step that you'll go through in the overall editing process. The first step in the editing process is image selection. Usually when you shoot a batch of photos, you have some favorites that you've already selected in your mind, but it's important to go through all of the photos that you take in a session, because sometimes the images that you were really drawn to when you were taking your photos end up being a little bit more average, and something that you weren't really thinking of too much might end up being the best photo from that session. So going through all of the photos that you take is a great practice, and judging them for face value in that given moment. When I have a big batch of photos, I find it best to take multiple passes at the images, first going through all of the images and picking out the images that I think are good, then looking at those good images and only picking the ones that I think are great, and then looking at those great images and only picking out the best of the best images and trying to narrow down my selections to something like 3 or 5 images. Within Photos, you can do this process by favoriting your images or separating them into separate albums. Cropping is a crucial part of the editing process because it's essentially a second chance to recompose your image. Through cropping, you can focus the viewer's attention exactly where you want it and refine the balance and overall composition of your image. Cropping distracting elements should be a main consideration. When I crop my images, I usually scan the edges of my frame to look for any elements that might be peeking into my image that aren't giving enough visual weight to really be included, and by including them, it's kind of distracting away from my main subject. Cropping those out can really tidy up your image. Finding the right amount of space around your subject is a bit of a balancing act, but with more practice, you can become more comfortable with figuring out what that proper amount of space is. A crop that's too tight or open can create unnecessary tension for your viewer. A secondary tool within your cropping section in Photos is rotation. Typically, you'll want to use rotation to make sure that you have a straight horizon. You can also crop your subjects to different aspect ratios than the ones that they were shot in. Different aspect ratios are necessary for different applications. On social media, the common aspect ratios are 1:1 or square, 4:5 vertically, or a 9:16 for a story post. The most common print aspect ratios are 4:6, 5:7, and 8:10. Using different aspect ratios doesn't need to just be a utilitarian process. It can also be used as a creative tool. Sometimes using a different aspect ratio can refine the balance and composition of your image. If you have a lot of negative space leaning on the top or bottom, you can change your aspect ratio to something closer to a square, and that can help to make things feel a bit tighter and not so open or loose, and again, just refine that balance or composition. In the top toolbar of your cropping section in Photos, you'll see an icon for your aspect ratio section. By tapping this, you'll be able to affect the aspect ratio of your crop into your original aspect ratio, a freeform mode, which will allow you to drag the corners freely into a crop, or you can select square, wallpaper, or some of the more common aspect ratios by scrolling to the right to reveal more. You can also switch between a horizontal or vertical orientation. It's important to know that as we crop in on our images, we lose resolution. An image that was taken with a 12 megapixel camera like our iPhones only has so much room to actually crop in. If we crop in 2 times, we're going to be left with a 6 megapixel image. The 48 megapixel Apple Pro RAW files leave you a lot more room to crop in without losing detail. With those JPEG files, you can certainly crop as a corrective tool, but be wary about cropping in too much on your subject. It's better to step into your subject when you're shooting your photos if possible. Interestingly, if you take a photo using your square or wallpaper aspect ratio in camera, your iPhone camera is still capturing that image using its natural 4:3 aspect ratio. It's just pre-cropping your image. So later on in editing, you can actually expand that image back to its 4:3 ratio. On this slide, we can see an overview of the crop section and some of the tools that I haven't gone over in this course because they don't commonly apply to food photography. Exposure correction is a very important part of the editing process. Without exposure, without light, we don't have a photograph. A properly exposed image has detail across the range of shadows, midtones, and highlights. That's not to say that slight under or overexposure can't be used as a creative tool. As we learned in the last section, saturation can also be impacted by your exposure. So if your images are feeling a little dull, maybe increasing your exposure and increasing your contrast can make those colors pop a little bit more. As I mentioned earlier in this course, adjusting your exposure with JPEGs is quite limited, and it's important to get your exposure correct in camera when you're shooting with JPEG. It's especially important to expose for your highlights because in editing, it's very hard to get any lost detail from your highlights back. Darker shadows can be lifted to good effect in editing. So if you're going to lean one way or the other, lean towards a darker image than too bright of an image. The tools and photos that we can use to affect our exposure are the exposure tool and the brightness tool. The exposure tool is going to have more of an effect on the highlights of your image, which generally make it a better tool to use to darken your image. And your brightness tool is going to have more of an effect on the midtones or darker part of your image. So that generally makes it a better tool to use to brighten your image. Dynamic range is the ratio between the darkest and brightest tones that a camera can capture in a single image. In editing, we can increase the perceived dynamic range by brightening our shadows and darkening our highlights. This can infuse a little bit more detail into both of these sides of the spectrum. This process should be used with a little bit of caution because doing this too much can result in a really low contrast image and can look quite unnatural. The tools and photos that can affect dynamic range are brilliance, highlights, shadows, contrast, and black point. The brilliance tool is actually a tool that is attempting to do this process of darkening highlights and brightening shadows. By increasing your brilliance, you're going to increase that perceived dynamic range. By decreasing your brilliance, you're going to decrease that perceived dynamic range and introduce a little bit more contrast into your image. The white balance editing process adjusts the color casts in your image. Generally speaking, you want the neutral elements in your image to appear neutral. A good practice when altering your white balance in editing is to find a neutral part of your image and zoom into that area and use your corrective tools until that neutral area appears neutral. Then you can zoom back out to view your image and make any fine-tune adjustments from there to make the whole overall image sit properly. White balance can also be used as a creative tool. Commonly, when I take photos in bright daylight, I will make my white balance appear a little bit warmer than neutral. And when shooting in overcast light, I'll make my scenes a bit cooler than neutral. I find that these color casts fit the mood that these different types of light naturally give off. The tools that we can use in photos to affect our white balance are called warmth and tint. Warmth is going to adjust color cast on a blue to yellow spectrum, and tint is going to affect color cast on a green to magenta spectrum. The color correction process adjusts the colors in your image so that they appear natural. This is a very important process for food photography where we want the colors in our image to generally appear neutral and natural and well saturated. When we do this, we can ensure that our food looks pleasing and appetizing. The tools and photos that you can use for color correction are saturation and vibrance. Saturation is going to affect the intensity of the colors across your whole image, and vibrance is going to target all of the colors that appear undersaturated, and it's going to protect your skin tones. Contrast can fix that dull image. If your image is appearing too dull and your subject isn't standing out enough in your image, then adding more contrast into your image is a great process to make it stand out. If your lighting is too harsh and it's hard to make out certain details in your subject, then reducing the contrast in your image can help to add some of those details back into your subject. Filters and presets are pre-made editing templates for your images and can be a quick way to make an edit on your photos. Filters or presets will commonly need to be fine-tuned to your particular image, but they can be a great place to start your edit. Currently, Photos has 9 available filters to use, 6 of which are color filters and 3 of which are black and white filters. The best way to go about using these filters is to make sure that you're scaling the intensity of the filter. Commonly, these filters are going to be a little bit too extreme for your images. So dialing back that filter will blend it into your image a little bit more naturally. When I'm selecting a filter for my image, I'm looking for the way that it's impacting the colors of my image and especially the colors of my subject. Color correcting is a lot more intensive of a process in editing. So if I can find a filter that gets the colors in my image right off the bat, then that's one less thing that I have to do in editing, and I can just focus on getting the contrast right in my image. Color correction is also an area where photos is lacking, so I certainly can't pick a filter that negatively affects the colors in my image because it'll be a lot harder to kind of correct those issues. I'm focusing on just how to edit using photos in this course, but when it comes to filters and presets, I would highly recommend looking into third-party apps like Lightroom, VSCO, Darkroom, or Afterlight. You can use these third-party editing apps to apply a certain filter, and then you can export that image back into photos and complete your editing from there. Lastly, it's important to consider the editing approach. By knowing the tools that you have available to you, you'll be able to better creative problem solve. Having a direction before you start your edit is a great practice. When you look at your photo, ask yourself what the main problem is with your photo and why you're editing it in the first place. Does it lack contrast? Does the crop need to be refined? Are the colors not saturated enough? Start there. First, solve that problem, and that'll probably lead you to the next problem to solve and the next until the image is problem-free in your eyes and your edit is complete. Editing is not a linear process. It's a lot of jumping around and problem solving from one problem to the next, and then maybe you get your contrast sitting right, but then when you affect your saturation, you end up wanting to dial back your contrast. So it's a lot of back and forth, and each of the tools kind of interplays with one another. Jumping around is natural and it's normal. This editing process is largely intuitive and requires a certain amount of taste. You need to know when to stop editing, when your editing has become too much. When you're editing in photos, a good practice is to tap on your image every now and then to reset your image back to what it looked like before you started your editing. This will sort of recalibrate your eyes so that when you look back at your image in its current form after your edits, you can see if you've gone a little bit too far and if you need to dial back that edit. When I'm editing, it's very common that I go too far and I have to come back. I go too far and I have to come back. I think that's just part of the natural editing process. Knowing when to dial it back is key to getting a good photo. You can develop this taste by studying other photographers, by looking at other photographers' work on Instagram, Flickr, or Pinterest. On this slide, you can see a roundup of the most important concepts that we've gone over in this course. Again, this slide is great to print out and use beyond this course as a guide instead of having to look back through this whole section. You can just look at this slide and get a general overview of all of the important concepts that we've discussed. In the next section of this course, we're going to wrap things up by looking at the key takeaways from this course.